Good evening. My name is Mike Barsanti, and I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. I want to welcome you to our 289th annual dinner, and our first, and I hope it's our last, virtual annual dinner. I'm especially grateful to all of you tonight for joining us from the comfort of your own homes. This is usually the part of the program where we are all seated and we're eating together and drinking together and enjoying each other's company. Tonight we're not able to do that in person, but we are able to celebrate the Library Company together as we have done for many years. And we have a lot of things to brag about and a lot of things to share with you. In the last 6 months, the Library Company, for most of this time, the Library Company has been closed to the public. For a while it was even closed to staff. But we've used that time to really retool the organization. We've rebuilt our computer systems. We've fixed our HVAC systems. We've worked on our alarm systems. We've made a lot of repairs and improvements to our buildings and systems that will make us an even more robust organization as we prepare to reopen. We've also taken all of our programming and brought almost all of it online. And those of you who have been following it have been able to see some really remarkable programs through our Fireside Chat series, our seminar series, and some of our donor events, which have included tours, remote tours. So in this event, as with all of our other events, we've gone remote, and it's actually provided a way for us to reach more people. More people have been attending our programs as a result. So the circle of people celebrating the Library Company gets wider and wider. The centerpiece of tonight's program is a talk by Rick Atkinson, who's going to share with us part of his book and talk about the earliest days of the Revolutionary War. But we are also going to be celebrating our staff and our scholars and all the people who make the work of the Library Company possible. Not least in that list, of course, is you, as a supporter of the Library Company. I want to take a moment now to single out some of our supporters of tonight's event. I want to start by thanking our main sponsor, our presenting sponsor, who is an anonymous donor, who has given very generously to this event this year and has helped us to make some of this new technology happen for this program. I would also like to thank Mariah M. Thompson, who is the sponsor supporting our first book prize this year. You'll hear from our book prize winner shortly. And I'd also like to thank in particular our director level sponsors, who include Cornerstone Asset Advisors Asset Management, Kitty and Bob Demento, Louise M. and Peter J. Kelly, Michael M. Mann and Rhonda Chotskull, and our friends at PNC Bank. This evening celebrates a similar evening 289 years ago, back in 1731, when Ben Franklin got together with a group of his friends to celebrate. They were celebrating the fact that they had finally got 50 people to agree to subscribe to a brand new venture, a new public library. They had found 50 people in the small city of Philadelphia who were willing to put down 40 pounds to help them, 40 shillings, excuse me, not 40 pounds, with a lot more money, 2 pounds. But who were willing to put down a lot of money to start this venture that none of them had ever seen before. And I wonder sometimes that if Ben Franklin were here, what he would say about this institution and its history. Oh, it's you. Welcome, Dr. Franklin.
Good evening, Michael. It's nice to see you. You ponder what I would say. It is as if I appear. Would you like to continue to tell them what I would say?
We speak of the devil, and he comes.
I've been called worse.
Well, please, Dr. Franklin.
Are you sure? Oh, you're
please.
very kind. Good evening, everyone. How nice of Michael to welcome you all. My name is Benjamin Franklin. I am the founder and original director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It's a great pleasure. It is a great pleasure. I cannot stress this enough, to see you all, even virtually. I love virtue, and so how appropriate this is. You know, as we stand here this evening, I am surrounded by my dearest friends, geography, history, philosophy. And yet it is not the books, it is not the logic and the critical thinking that I remember most most deeply. It is the people who helped found this company. My dear friend Robert Grace, John Penn, John Bartram. This, more than any other of the institutions I founded, this, the library company, bound us together. It strengthened our friendship, and I know that it will do the same for all of you. So thank you so much, my friends, for joining Michael and joining all of our very special presenters this evening. I cannot think of any organization more deserving of your support. With that in mind, I think it only appropriate that we offer a toast. So
Excellent.
If you would, Michael,
Excellent
play Mother.
idea.
And I shall offer all of you and invite all of you to, oh, thank you very much, to raise your glass. I can think of no better toast than the motto of the Library Company of Philadelphia, to pour forth benefit for the common good is divine.
Is divine, indeed.
Don't pour forth, drink forth. Cheers, my friend.
Cheers.
English?
French.
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 Good evening, my friends. Enjoy your evening, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin.
Michael.
And thank you all again. I'd like to now hear a couple of words from some of the sponsors of this event. I just briefly ago mentioned a lot of the sponsors early on, but I wanted to make sure you understood that there are many, many other sponsors we've had. Many people have sponsored this event with their generosity, and I'd like to refer you to our program where all of them are listed. And I just want to thank all of you for making this evening possible. Now I'd like to show you a couple of specific messages from sponsors of the event. Thank you.
Here at PNC, we know the value of a strong relationship. With over 165 years in Philadelphia as America's second oldest trust company, we partner with families and institutions across the Delaware Valley, providing wealth strategy, investment management, trust and estate solutions, along with private and commercial banking services. We are proud to continue our long-standing relationship with the Library Company of Philadelphia and are honored to support the 289th annual dinner.
Good evening. Cornerstone would like to congratulate the Library Company of Philadelphia for its 289th annual dinner. As I wrote, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Huzzah!
Thanks again to PNC and to Cornerstone Asset Management for those messages. And thanks again to all of our sponsors for making tonight possible and for supporting all the work we do at the Library Company. One of the greatest strengths of the Library Company is our staff. Their care for all kinds of scholars, their knowledge of our collections, their dedication to our mission, our vision, and our future is the heart and soul of our institution. And tonight I wanted to recognize some of our staff members who have reached milestone anniversaries in their time at the Library Company. Fran Dolan, our Facilities and Operations Manager, has reached his 5-year anniversary. Rachel Hammer, our Chief Development Officer, has been with us for 5 years. Jose Placeres, our Facilities Assistant, also for 5 years. And M. Ricciardi, our Cataloger, has been with the Library Company for 5 years. Cornelia King, better known as Connie, our Curator of Women's History and Chief of Reference, has been at the Library Company for 20 years. Connie is really one of the essential people of the Library Company and one of the people that when I talk to scholars or fellows, they always mention as one of the people who is most helpful and most knowledgeable in supporting them and supporting their work. Connie's own research, her research into the history of philanthropy, her research into the history of women's associations, has been a lot of the organizing premise around our program in women's history. And Connie's exhibition that's up now, Women Get Things Done, is a great expression of a lot of Connie's work and of the understanding that she has brought to our collection. Rachel D'Agostino, our curator of printed books, is also celebrating her 20th anniversary with the Library Company. Rachel is such a remarkable employee, and I think one of the things that makes her remarkable is her versatility and the number of roles she has had at the Library Company. Rachel is conversant in security, in facilities, in climate control, in cataloging, in our whole system of acquiring and accessioning new books. She is also our expert in popular medicine and has been doing a lot of research in our new collections of popular medicine that we've acquired. But I think also one of the things that I think is one of Rachel's greatest strengths as an employee is the way in which she advocates for other employees here at the Library Company. She looks out for everybody, and she's always looking for opportunities for people. And she is exceedingly generous in helping to identify opportunities for people where they can advance themselves and develop new skills. It's something I really appreciate about her and has benefited the Library Company enormously. I want to mention Andrea Krupp. Andrea is one of our conservators, part of a team of 3 women in our conservation department who together have served nearly 100 years. Andrea is having her 35th anniversary here at the Library Company. Andrea is both an artist and a conservator. Her work here has showcased her knowledge of cloth book bindings in particular, not dust jackets. And it's also just her personality galvanizes people. I thought it would be best to have Andrea's friend and co-worker, Jennifer Rosner, talk a little bit about Andrea and her time here at the Library Company.
Thanks, Mike. When people hear how long both Andrea Krupp and I have been working for the Library Company, they often joke that we must have been hired when we were children. Maybe we were. We will just have to keep everyone guessing about that. Andrea started working in the Conservation Department just about exactly 35 years ago. She has always worked part-time so that she can pursue a very active career as a visual artist. This talent of hers is often reflected in her work at the Library Company. She has a unique and thoughtful way of looking at our materials and sees things in a way that may not be obvious to everyone else. Over the years, she has curated 2 exhibitions on the history of bookbinding and is working now on a 3rd that will open next year. Keep an eye out in May for her exhibition titled Seeing Coal, Time, Material, Scale. It will be a visual culture study of coal and will include some of her artwork as well. The Conservation Department has always had a comfortable, conflict-free atmosphere. We've worked together so long that we really are a well-oiled machine. We pitch in for each other and try to be as flexible as possible. That and our mutual continued fascination with the Library Company's amazing collection is why we have lasted as long as we have. I've enjoyed working with Andrea, and I want to congratulate her on her 35 years at the Library Company.
Thank you, Jennifer, for those kind words about Andrea. Now we get to talk about Jennifer herself. Jennifer Rosner has been with the Library Company for 40 years. Really a landmark anniversary for any employee. It's very, very rare for anyone to stay with an organization and to serve it for as long as Jennifer has. Jennifer has been an enormously valuable person to the Library Company and very valuable to me as someone who can use her tenure and her good sense and her good judgment to help me navigate various decisions and help me understand better how the Library Company works. I thought it would be best for Jennifer to have her friend and a longtime friend of the Library Company, our trustee emeritus, Michael Zinman, say a few words about her and about her time here.
I'd like to thank you, Michael, for asking me to speak about Jennifer. At the same time, I want to admonish you that you're taking away time that she is far better useful for in her work, but I can forgive you for this transgression. Jennifer is certainly the apex of the profession in America. Her work is simply sublime, and she's a professional. And my feeling is that that's the best accolade I can give any craftsman in their work. Her work is, she's incapable of not doing fine work. She's incapable of cutting corners, and she's incapable of speeding up things just to get them done. And it's the benefit to the library company is compounded daily by her presence and her ability to do the work that she does and to train and assist others who are coming up in the profession and carrying on what she's learned. I wish her that I'd like her to be at the library company for another 25 or 30 years, but 15 years will be probably sufficient for her to accomplish and to train the next generation. But less than that is simply not permissible.
Thank you, Michael. There's one name you may be thinking about that's in your program books, but we haven't yet talked about tonight, and that is our librarian, Jim Green. Last year, we celebrated Jim's 35th anniversary here at the Library Company, and soon we will be celebrating Jim's upcoming retirement. The announcement in the program book mentions it, but we also are currently looking for someone to succeed Jim. No one will ever replace him. But I look forward to sharing with you in the near future an announcement of a new librarian, but also, more importantly, an opportunity to celebrate Jim and his tenure as librarian and all of the people he has helped during his time here. The only thing that gives me some relief in talking about Jim's retirement is knowing that he's not going to go away, but has promised that he's going to stick around the library company in order to do some of his own research. So I look forward to working with Jim in his new life once he leaves his post as librarian, but we'll all be able to celebrate that together soon. We've talked about the staff that are really the heart of the library company, but what really makes the library company unique is the relationship between the staff and the researchers or scholars who work here. Any kind of scholars, not just our fellows, but all the folks who use our materials. The one thing I hear over and over again from our patrons is how important it is that they are able to work with our staff to understand our collections. But really, that's what the library company does every day, is it connects scholars to our collections. And what we're known for being the best at is serving our fellows and serving our scholars. So I thought it would be great for you to hear from one of our scholars, Professor Derek Spires, who's going to talk about his time at the Library Company when he was an Albert M. Greenfield Fellow in African American History back in 2008. Professor Spires' work here then became the basis for his book, The Practice of Citizenship. Professor Spires is an associate professor of English at Cornell, and I look forward to hearing him talk a little bit about his time here at the Library Company and how important his work here has been to his work as a scholar.
Good evening, everyone. The Library Company of Philadelphia has been and remains one of the most important sites for studying African American print culture. Its Afro-Americana collection provided the foundation for my work in the practice of citizenship, including copies of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's 1794 narrative of the proceedings of the Black people, Benjamin Banneker's 1792 letter to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Phyllis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, and an array of newspapers and convention minutes. And while much of this material has now been digitized, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this space and the people here, the archivists, catalogers, and other researchers to our own work. My first extended visit to the library company was as a graduate student in 2008 at the early dissertation stage. The intimacy of the reading room cultivated a sense of camaraderie and generosity. Conversations with Phil Lapsansky in particular were critical to helping me understand the wide range of Black print happening in the early United States. And others can attest to this experience. After I told him a bit about what I was researching, mind you, I was a graduate student at this point, and he had no special reason to give me attention. In any case, he randomly shows up with this thick binder of stuff, including abolition broadsides and other documents and speeches. At the same time, a conversation with Jim Green did more for my understanding of job printing and how Black intellectuals might have circulated their work in the late 18th century than hours of article and book reading. And then there's the actual material. I spent days reading the National Anti-Slavery Standard, Pennsylvania Freeman, pamphlets by Lemuel Haynes, James McCune Smith, and Francis Harper. I was in heaven. I was also losing my eyesight, but I digress. My most vivid memory remains reading an essay on the utility of newspapers in the United States in the January 1st, 1794 issue of the Philadelphia Gazette. It was one of the first things I requested, and just holding and reading a newspaper from over 300 years ago blew my mind. It was a true sense of wonder. And then I read, quote, "Power may assail or corruption may undermine with success the best parchment barriers of liberty. But when a constitution rests on the good sense of a well-informed people, the breach will always be repaired," end quote. And then I just had to go take a walk. I want to close with another of my favorite objects, Benjamin Banneker's letter to Thomas Jefferson. While Banneker's pamphlet has been available to us in anthologies, there is something special about holding both Banneker's pamphlet and copies of his almanacs in my hands. There's no substitute for dealing with a material text. And even though I rarely write about emotional connections to writers and documents, you might say that those connections are happening between the words. Written on August 18, 1791, Banneker's letter responds to racist claims Jefferson made in Notes on the State of Virginia and levels a full-throated call for the abolition of slavery, using Jefferson's own words against him. Quote, "Sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that you should be found guilty of that most criminal act, which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves." I love the irony of Banneker placing Jefferson in a position where he feels compelled to address Banneker, a Black man, as "sir" in accordance with convention. And I by turns laughed at and raged against the irony of Jefferson's closing his letter. "I am, with great esteem, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson." What do you do with something like that? Especially now that the Broadway show Hamilton has rendered, "I have the honor to be your obedient servant," newly famous. The entire sequence of events shows Banneker cannily manipulating print, not only to publish an incisive anti-slavery pamphlet, but also to drum up interest in his almanac. It's just one of my favorite things about the Library Company of Philadelphia. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for that message. Producing scholarship is one of the most important things we do here at the Library Company. And not long after I came here, I thought it would be a great idea for us to give an award for a first book to one of our scholars as a way of recognizing what they're able to do with our collections, what kinds of new history they're able to discover in the materials that we have here. And it's been very exciting to watch this program begin to take flight. I'm very pleased this year also that the first book prize has been sponsored by Mariah M. Thompson, one of our trustees. Here to speak to you tonight about the first book prize is Will Fenton, our Director of Research and Public Programs.
Thank you, Dr. Barsanti. So 2 years ago, the Library Company awarded its first biennial book award, and that was to Zara Ennis Hanslin's Portrait of a Woman in Silk, a sublime choice. Ornate in structure, lyrical in prose, and incisive in its analysis of 18th century material culture, Portrait of a Woman in Silk set a very high bar for this award. It was also Ennis Hanslin's first book, which led me to ask, how many other exemplary first books would our researchers publish over the next 2 years? And if we did center our award on first monographs, could we use it to elevate the work of other early career scholars? Thanks to the generosity of Mariah M. Thompson, I was able to pursue these questions and to experiment with an even more rigorous solicitation and review process. After opening the process up to public submissions, our learning community responded with predictable brio, submitting more than 36 first books published between 2018 and 2020. An internal review committee comprised of Deirdre Cooper Owens, Kathy Matson, Erica Piola, Connie Kang, and Jim Green winnowed submissions to 5 finalists based upon their engagement with collection and program area strengths. Our external review committee was comprised of 3 former Library Company fellows who had excelled in the humanities, arts, and cultural heritage sector. Michael Blackman, Clytus Radiklani, and Molly Hardy rightfully encouraged us to recognize both the recipient of the award and to bestow an honorable mention to the quite remarkable runner-up. I am again indebted to Mariah Thompson, who embraced this late change and enabled us to recognize and support a second early career scholar. Indeed, Nora Doyle's Maternal Bodies, Redefining Motherhood in Early America, makes significant contributions to early American and gender studies. I certainly encourage all of you to read it. Today, it is my delight to announce the recipient of our first 2020 First Book Award. Lindsay DeCerchi's Colonial Revivals, the 19th Century Lives of Early American Books. Allow me to telegraph just a few remarks from our external committee members. Archivists and scholars alike cannot ignore this book, announced Clytus Radiklani. It is as argumentatively nuanced as it is informative about the objectives undergirding antiquarian acts of collecting, preserving, reprinting, and dissemination. Molly Hardy celebrated Colonial Revival's insights not only into collecting and reprinting in the 19th century, but also into the current digital age's archival turn. And Michael Blackman heralded the book's epilogue as a manifesto on the critical and ethical work of reproducing texts in the digital age, a tour de force that will prompt important conversations among archivists and digital historians. Colonial Revivals makes enormous contributions to the study of early American history, book history, and American antiquarianism. But perhaps most importantly, it really summons the convening spirit of Franklin's junto, creating an occasion for engagement between librarians, archivists, and scholars. The Library Company is proud to have served as a vital site of its formation. Thank you for producing this remarkable work, Lindsay.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to the committee that selected Colonial Revivals for this award. And thank you, too, for drawing attention to first books and helping them find new audiences. I was absolutely floored to receive this award, especially because it came from the Library Company. This book really couldn't have been possible without the collections, the remarkable staff, and the fellows that I met here when I had a short-term fellowship about a decade ago. I owe a great debt to the Library Company, and now even more so. Thank you again. I'm tremendously honored.
It is now my pleasure to welcome Hal Rosenberg, President of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Will. And welcome everyone to our first and hopefully last virtual annual dinner. Tonight's speaker is Rick Atkinson. Rick started his career in journalism. Beginning around 1975, he started working at the Morning Sun in Pittsburgh, Kansas. From 77 to 1983, he worked at the Kansas City Times. While he was at the Kansas City Times in 1982, he won the first of his 3 Pulitzer Prizes and this one was for national reporting. National reporting, and the recognition was for a body of work, including a series on the West Point class of 1966 and its participation in Vietnam. Subsequently, this became his first book, the best-selling, highly acclaimed The Long Gray Line, which he released in 1989. In 1983, Rick joined the Washington Post, where he served as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and editor. While at the Post, he covered the Persian Gulf War, and he wrote his second book, Crusade, the untold story of the Persian Gulf War, and that book was released in 1993. He also served as bureau chief in Berlin, where he covered Germany, NATO, and spent a lot of time in Somalia and Bosnia. He returned from Europe in 1996 and became the assistant managing editor for investigations at the Washington Post. In that role, he directed and edited a series that dealt with shootings by the DC Police Department, which led to his second Pulitzer Prize. This one was for public service. While he left the Post in 1999 to devote his time to writing what turned out to be his astounding liberation trilogy on the European War during World War II, he returned to the Post in 2003 to cover the Iraq War. During that assignment, he spent 2 months with the 101st Airborne and with General David Petraeus. His experiences there led to his masterful 2004 book about the Iraq War, In the Company of Soldiers, A Chronicle of Combat. He returned to the Post in 2007 to report on the proliferation of roadside bombs in modern warfare. To pursue that investigation piece, he had to make trips to Afghanistan and Iraq. His writing on that topic won him the prestigious Gerald R. Ford Award for distinguished reporting on national defense. In 2002, he released the first volume of his liberation trilogy, An Army at Dawn, the War in North Africa, 1942 to 1943, which the Wall Street Journal called the best World War II battle narrative since Cornelius Ryan's D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. For that effort, he won his third Pulitzer, this time for history. That book was followed in 2007 by the Day of the Battle, the War in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 1944, and in 2013, The Guns at Last Light, the War in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945, which was ranked #1 on the New York Times hardcover nonfiction list. In addition to his Pulitzers, he has received more than 20 major awards for his work in military history and journalism, including the 1989 George Polk Journalism Award, the 2010 Pritzker Military Library Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing, the 2014 Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for Literature from the Society for Military History. He has also held the Omar N. Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership at the U.S. Army War College. He is a presidential counselor at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and is a member of the, by invitation only, Society of American Historians. Luckily for us, and for other fans of the history of our country's founding, Rick decided to focus his talents on the American Revolution. His 2019 book, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777, is the first of a planned trilogy about our war for independence. It is a magnificent work that has already garnered 4 major awards, including the George Washington Prize, which was awarded by Mount Vernon, and it's awarded by them for the year's best work on the founding era. He also won the New York Historical Society's Zelaznik Book Prize for the year's best book in American history or biography. That book, The British Are Coming, was also on the New York Times 100 Most Notable Books of 2019. The book, like all of Rick's previous work, demonstrates extraordinary scholarship. I mean, there are 133 pages of endnotes in this book, as you will see. In 2016, Queen Elizabeth allowed access to the archives of George III, all 300,000 plus pages of them. Rick availed himself of those archives, and I have no doubt that he was probably first in line when they opened them up. When you read this book, you will see that he put those archives to great use, for he gives us a unique perspective of the war from the British side as well as from the American side. But of course, it's not just scholarship that makes Rick's books great. It's his skill as a writer. And I am here to tell you, having read many of Rick's books, this guy can write. Joseph Ellis, famous historian from Harvard, said, "To say that Rick can write is like saying Sinatra can sing." In his review of The British Are Coming, Ellis commented that while reading Rick's book, it was as if Ken Burns traveled in a time machine and captured historical scenes on film as they were happening. That is the power and strength of Rick as a narrative historian. I can think of no greater compliment that can be paid to any writer, let alone a writer of history. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Rick Atkinson.
Good evening, Hal, and thanks so much for that very generous, gracious introduction and for inviting me to be with you virtually this evening. I'm well aware of the glorious history of the library company, beginning with Benjamin Franklin 289 years ago, and the ideals and aspirations of the library are as important to us today as they've ever been, if not more important than they've ever been. In the work I'm doing now, I have the privilege of living with Franklin, metaphorically day in and day out, and he's an extraordinary companion. He too should be as important to us today as he's ever been. And personally, Philadelphia is a touchstone for me. My mother grew up in Delaware County in Prospect Park. Her father was a Philadelphia banker. My father grew up across the river in Moorestown. His father owned a small business in Philadelphia. My aunt was the head librarian at the Pedagogical Library for the Philadelphia Board of Education. I've got a deep emotional attachment to your town. So as you mentioned, Hal, I spent almost 15 years writing a 3-volume, 750,000-word narrative about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II. And even before the final volume came out, I was pondering what to do next. I kept thinking of Jack London's advice that rather than sit back and wait for inspiration, a writer ought to light out after it with a club. The obvious thing for me would have been to pivot to the Pacific and to do for that campaign in World War II what I had done for the campaigns in the Mediterranean and Western Europe. But that would have required me to start World War II over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier. And that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a personal fascination I've had since I was a kid with a different war in an earlier century. So I took my club and set out after it. Well, I've now completed the first volume of what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. The British Are Coming opens with an extended prologue in June 1773, when King George III travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a fantastic, proud display of military muscle, precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire, with victory in the 7 Years' War, or as we know it, the French and Indian War. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was coined. And the book ends with the two battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton in January 1777, which together resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished. The second volume, which I'm now working on hammer and tongs, will include events close to home for you, including the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, the British occupation of Philadelphia, the battle for the Delaware Valley Forge, the Battle of Monmouth. And I'm spending a lot of quality time with Franklin in Paris as he becomes the greatest diplomat in American history. Let me suggest that there is a lot to dislike about the founders and the war they fought for American independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves, 1 in 5 of all souls occupying the 13 colonies when those words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for Native Americans, women, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even fence straddlers skeptical of armed rebellion against their government, often were subjected to dreadful treatment. Public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes execution. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine, lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams later said, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemy in the contest." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, the Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by negotiation and blandishment, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, American invasion of another land under the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab a musket on behalf of freedom is mostly mythical. During the Revolution, General George Washington's army was rarely larger than 20,000 troops, and on occasion dwindled to 3,000 in a country of 2.5 million people. And especially after the initial martial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill faded in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for military service, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and often badly led Continental Army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and thrilling? Even in November 2020, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, that story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the profoundest question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans died for the cause, and possibly many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to perish in any conflict other than the Civil War. So, what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? First, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but also, as the Declaration of Independence insists, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with grit, wisdom, and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils. existential perils before. It should be of great comfort. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power, and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot permit it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift for the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. The American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values, conflicting visions of what the world could become. The Americans eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Certainly the rebels could be wrong-headed in believing they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, for example. Or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imaginations and who night after night minced across the stage in Hamilton, at least before the pandemic arrived. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. One, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of inciting a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And three, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Ireland, Canada, Sugar Islands of the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel America into Vietnam 2 centuries later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from English and Irish ports. But of 40 transport vessels dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 reached the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain, or blown to the West Indies, or were intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep carried aboard ships that actually made it to Boston, that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the voyage across the ocean. 40 of those 550 arrived alive. 290 hogs shipped, just 74 survived the trip. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776 and requested 950 horses to pull artillery carriages and supply wagons, 412 of the 950 horses sent from Britain died at sea during the voyage. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Now, even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf in the Revolution, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February 1776, half mentioned munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, especially gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead, and by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of this stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets and clocks and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass canes and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, Americans imported 15 million bushels annually, half from the West Indies and half from Britain or Southern Europe. The British trade embargo, once the shooting started, strangled 2/3 of those imports. To encourage salt works along the coast, pamphlets were printed with salt-making recipes. All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote. But 400 gallons of seawater were needed to boil off a bushel of salt, which required great stacks of firewood. Virginia spent more than 6,000 pounds, an enormous sum in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay, but collected only 50 bushels, perhaps the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork on the southern coast of Ireland, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat, which soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles, the daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat. A gill is 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month, which gives you an idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. That took an enormous amount of shipping space. Let me talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. As Hal mentioned, Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owns, as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers from all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, most from the reign of George III, most of them previously unpublished, and I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 at Windsor Castle, west of London, where the papers are stored. Every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate, and again at the Norman gate, and then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers, in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind, and he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, he also made the copies. And as you paw through these pages, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775, of Royal Navy vessels under construction, various shipyards, of all his regiments in America with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file troops for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margin as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup: rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver, and insecticide: wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He's interested in everything from music and astronomy to horology, the study of time, and the use of manures in agronomy. He'd married an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, who learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage to England from Germany. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15. And we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply to dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. Now, the war he chooses to wage it, is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing is usually intimate in the 18th century, at very close range, face to face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards and almost hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19th, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 or so actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. On the other hand, massed musket firing, clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs flying down range at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, if you're hitting the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hitting the head, your chance of survival is even less. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, especially those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but harder to load and they couldn't carry a bayonet, learned to target the brightest of the redcoats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. In the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Now, the British are coming is not something Paul Revere called out while galloping through the Middlesex countryside in the very early morning of April 19, 1775. That wouldn't have made sense to people who at that moment still thought of themselves as British. What he's quoted as shouting over and over is, "The regulars are coming out," meaning the British regular troops coming out of Boston. But I use "the British are coming" as a title because it's a metaphor for what those first couple of years of the war are about. The British are coming relentlessly, with most of their ferocious professional army, with nearly half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, and with 30,000 German mercenaries, Hessians. They're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and burn your towns. It's a dire thing. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare, but what of the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant from us as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic. They're far less ironic and less skeptical in worldview than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own argot and idiom, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in 18th century America, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes referred to Americans derisively as Jonathans. But those are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months when she wrote him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt, and take great pleasure doing it, she told him, and keep faith with the future. She signed her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." Now, if the central figures in our creation story have frequently been embalmed in reverence, they nonetheless remain beguiling, worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in 1799. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander at Long Island, Fort Washington, Brandywine, it goes on and on, other battlefields. The man who proverbially would never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. And Washington's carping about his troops, his officers, and his lot in life, "I distrust everything," he grumbled in 1776, transforms the demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. yet great responsibility enlarges it. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interests to a greater good, as well as other Republican virtues, small r, probity, dignity, moral stamina, incorruptibility, traits that should remain true north for every citizen today, traits we should demand in our leaders at all levels. First couple of years of the revolution that I describe in this book certainly brought bitter lessons for Washington that'll be familiar to any of you who have military experience. That war was rarely linear, preferring a path of fits and starts, ups and downs, triumphs and cataclysms. That only battle could reveal those with the necessary dark heart for killing, years of killing. That only those with the requisite stamina, aptitude, and luck would be able to see it through. And finally, the hardest of war's hard truths in 1776, that for a new nation to live, young men must die, often alone, usually in pain, and sometimes to no obvious purpose. Washington, more than anyone, would be responsible for ordering those men to their deaths. His faith gave others faith. His strength made others strong. As commanding general of the Continental Army, the indispensable man overseeing the indispensable institution, he also demonstrated a shrewd understanding of the refractory, independent peoples known collectively as Americans. Washington wrote in 1777, "A people unused to restraint must be led. They will not be drove." He was a leader. Well, lesser personalities largely lost to history speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. "Heaven only knows what may be my fate," Captain John McPherson wrote in a last letter to his father before being killed at Quebec. "I experience no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it." Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote his wife, "The dangers we are to encounter, I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, your father was a coward." He too died at Quebec. Even Benedict Arnold, perhaps the finest battle captain on either side early in the war before his subsequent perfidy, which of course began in Philadelphia, wrote after being shot in the leg in Canada, "I am in the way of duty, and I know no fear." Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shai wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war, because every war is about young men, and sometimes young women, dying young. My ambition has been to find that emotional grip, as Professor Shai put it, to revive the tragic, human, multi-sided quality that saturates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull, a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat toward Boston. Captured by the Americans in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel, he lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse before he too takes heaven by the way. Or we see Mary Pierce, the widow of a private killed at Bunker Hill while fighting with the Massachusetts militia, as she petitions the Commonwealth for precisely £5 and 12 shillings in compensation for her husband's lost coat, trousers, stockings, shoes, buckles, silk handkerchief, knife, and tobacco box. Or General Richard Montgomery in the assault on Quebec, hit by grape shot through both thighs and mortally through the face. His effects were auctioned off to his officers a couple days after his death, item by item. 2 volumes of Polybius, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, a buffalo skin and clothes brush bought by Captain Aaron Burr, and a wardrobe including ruffled shirts, Holland waistcoats, and a pair of tea tongs, all bought by Benedict Arnold. Or we see Illinois, the island of nuts. It's a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell, half of them suffering from smallpox, dysentery, typhus, or some other god-awful malady, infested with lice and maggots. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept till I had not more power to weep." And we see Matthew Patton of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Illinois. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." The historian Bruce Catton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy. Surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. The cause of America, wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, is the cause of all mankind. Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2020. Who do we want to be? Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish told us. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Thank you for doing last week, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, written in your town. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's dynamic, never a thing done, something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring, the creation of the American Republic among mankind's most remarkable achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly swatting men in Philadelphia asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks again so much for asking me to join you this evening. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike. And thank you. That was an extraordinary talk. And I want to thank Rick Atkinson for spending this time with us and for talking about his book, for giving us his book and his research. I think we're all especially attuned to how Rick was reminding us about the responsibilities of democracy and the responsibility of being a learning community in the midst of a democracy. One of Franklin's comments about the library company was that he felt that the access to learning that it provided to Americans played in some small part a role, he felt, in the way that Americans would seek their own rights as a country. Franklin saw the close connection between learning and being part of a civil society, a democracy that would stand on its own. And I'm grateful to Rick both for bringing us back to, reminding us of what was at stake for those who fought in the American Revolution, at the same time that he also brings back with such granularity, with so much of the sights, the smells, down to the last grain of gunpowder, down to the last ounce of salt pork, the last cartridge, an ounce of lead, the real physical world that those who fought in the Revolution were in. Rick has also generously agreed to answer questions for us tonight. I'd ask if you have questions for Rick, don't raise your hand, we won't see you, but use the chat function within Zoom, and then I'll read the questions off of Zoom, and Rick will ask and Rick will answer them. Just to get you started, Rick, and as people start to find their keyboards to type you a question, both Hal and yourself both mentioned the extraordinary opportunity you got to look at the papers of George III. And really the prologue, as you mentioned, the prologue of your book is extraordinary, that depiction of George III's visit to Portsmouth. Would you share with us something you found in those papers that surprised you or that hadn't been known by researchers before?
Yeah, Mike, and thanks again for the opportunity to be with you. Because most of those 300,000 pages have not been published previously, there's a lot that's there. A lot of it is the ordinary workings of a monarch and a father. I mentioned the 15 kids, the correspondence to two of the sons who will become king. George IV, known at that time as George P., George Prince, versus George R., George Rex, is a total scoundrel from childhood, and he'll be a scoundrel as king when he ascends the throne in 1820. So you see a letter from George III to young Prince George. I got you out of the problem with that prostitute one time. Don't expect me to do it again. You see him scolding the children, encouraging the children. William, who will join the Royal Navy, he'll actually be in New York at the end of the Revolution. He will become William IV, is encouraged by his father, who talks in naval terms with him. The granularity of the list making, you see, first of all, that he's quite obsessive compulsive. Almost all of his correspondence not only has the date, it has the precise time. So it'll be 7:03 p.m., Kew Palace, August 16th, 1776. The relationship with the Queen, the relationships with particularly Lord North, his prime minister, known then as the first minister, who had been a childhood friend of George, who didn't want to be a war minister, hated being a war minister, tried to resign over and over and over again. And you see the king bucking him up at every opportunity, saying, we've got to see this thing through. Blows must decide. Again, really driving the train of the war against his own people. And so, you know, what comes out of it is a flawed, compulsive, determined man who gets, as the war goes on, more determined and never seems to really question it until virtually the end of the war, till Yorktown, really, in 1781. And even then doesn't want to give it up. He's a difficult adversary, and we're going to find him in my next volume to be ever more resolved to kill as many Americans as necessary to bring them back to their duty.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions have come in. You have a question from none other than Benjamin Franklin. Mr. Atkinson, you are a journalist and a historian, and you have won the Pulitzer Prize for Journalism multiple times. I am led to believe the prize comes with a very handsome-looking medal, Dr. Franklin points out. Please tell us about receiving such an illustrious honor. Also, when researching your books, do you read newspapers from the 1700s? How have newspapers changed since the 18th century.
Yeah, Ben would be interested in that, wouldn't he? It doesn't come with a medal, Dr. Franklin. Actually, they're on a shelf behind me. It's kind of a tattered, badly mounted piece of paper from Columbia University, but it's obviously nice to have. I will tell you that when I won the Pulitzer Prize for History for An Army at Dawn, the first book in my trilogy about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, I was in Iraq with General Petraeus and the 101st Airborne. We were in Najaf. Fighting was still going on. It was early April of 2003. And I had called using a satellite phone to call in my daily story to the Washington Post. And I was told, hang on, we want, the editors want to talk to you. Well, satellite time at that point was, incredibly expensive. And I waited and I waited and I waited. They finally came on and they said, we're not sure when we can find you again, but we wanted you to know that you just won the Pulitzer Prize for History. So that was nice. We don't need a medal when that happens. I do use newspapers from that period. I use them extensively because it really does give you a nitty-gritty sense, first of all, the political winds, because the newspapers tend to be aligned with one faction or another, but also of the happenings in Philadelphia or New York or London. Newspapers have changed enormously. For one thing, I think they were better read back then. You had very few other outlets of information coming in. Newspapers were valuable. There was no CNN or C-SPAN or whatever. The typography obviously was pretty unsophisticated. With all due respect to Dr. Franklin, printing methods were pretty unsophisticated, pretty crude. Anybody trying to read those papers today where the type is small and crammed together knows that. But I find them very valuable for capturing a moment or moments in time that's hard to find any other way.
Thank you. Ned Donahue asks, thanks you for your brilliant talk, and asks how far along you are with Volume 2.
Thank you, Ned. You sound like a publisher. I'm working hard at it. I mentioned to someone earlier this evening that archives, libraries, battlefields being closed for the last 8 months hasn't made it any easier, but I have in this house in Washington, D.C., enough reading material to keep me in quarantine for a couple of years. There's an enormous amount that's now available online that's been digitized. The papers of Dr. Franklin and Washington, Adams, Jefferson have all been beautifully curated and digitized. So that will keep me busy. Getting into archives like those at Windsor is where I make my money, and I'm an archive rat at heart. I love the mystery of the next unopened archival box, and so I'm looking forward to being able to get back into these critical places that I need to see to find primary sources that allow me to find those little brush strokes of detail, which is the essence of how I do narrative history.
We're struggling with trying to stay open to our readers as well. We certainly would love to have you here for any materials that you need. We're open, but that's been, we, along with every other research collection, we are struggling with trying to balance the safety of our staff and the safety of our collections against the needs for scholars to produce scholarship. And it's been a difficult balance, and I hope we don't have to do it for too much longer. I'm sure there are a lot of books that are being slowed down, a lot of knowledge productions being slowed down in the process. Let me give you a couple more questions.
Sure.
Randall Miller asks, because you've gotten to know George III so well by reading his papers, as few have had the opportunity to do, what do you think Curious George III, that's Randall's, not mine, learned about and from the American Revolution? besides his famous wonderment of George Washington not wanting to be king?
Yeah. You know, I sometimes wonder whether he learned anything from it. He becomes so intractable and so stubborn, so relentless in trying to prosecute the war that, you know, you see his limitations as a monarch, as a leader. It's painful to watch, even though I'm, as an American, rooting for us. I see the difficulties that Britain is going to have. Now, he is absolutely convinced, virtually to the bitter end, that if the American colonies break away, it's the end of the British Empire. Winston Churchill at one time said, as World War II was coming to an end, I was not made the king's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. Well, he was, as it turned out, because that British Empire dissolved after World War II. And the British Empire that had been formed after the 7 Years' War is also going to dissolve. They're going to lose about a third of their landmass. They picked up Canada and 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachian Mountains and parts of India and Sugar Islands and all that. They're going to lose a substantial portion of that. But another British Empire is going to come along. They are going to fight yet another war with France. It's what they do. And out of that war, which will end in 1815, you'll have a British Empire that's even bigger, broader, richer than the empire that has begun to fray seriously around the edges in 1783 when the Treaty of Paris is made. You know, George will be monarch for a good portion of that war. He's going to have a dreadful last decade of his life, really, because he will get desperately ill, mentally ill. So he is not going to he's not going to really understand what has happened by 1815. He finds himself a good war prime minister. And I think that's critical. It's one of the things that hampers the British efforts in the American Revolution to wage a successful war, because Lord North just doesn't have the heart. He's an extraordinarily capable parliamentarian. He's a pretty good Treasury Secretary, but he is not a war minister. And what the king is going to need is a good war minister. And I think that's one thing that he does take out of his experience in the American Revolution.
I'm going to ask you one last question. We have a couple that have come in, and I hope maybe there'll be time to answer them separately, or perhaps in another session we can talk about them. But I wanted to read the question from John Meggs. John says, "You've seen the U.S. initiated wars over the last half century. Do you think that the U.S. can go back to caring about people outside the United States without feeling we have to take military action that we believe to be on their behalf? I'm General M.C. Meggs's first cousin, and I suspect you were engaged in various endeavors with him. I'm not suggesting what we did in Bosnia was bad, but I think John's question speaks for itself. But what lessons, having studied so much of 20th century American military involvement, what do you bring from your study of the Revolutionary War to that, and what do you see in the positioning of the U.S. military at this point? That connects back to that.
Thanks for that good question. I do know General Monty Meigs, your cousin, I assume. I first met him when he was a colonel in the Gulf War, and I've been to Iraq and to Afghanistan with him, so I know him very well. And tell him I said hi when you see him. I hope so. I hope that we learn the benefit of soft power. I think one of the things that happened when we came out of World War II as a victor, an overwhelming victor, really the only one of the combatants that had our industrial base intact. 2/3 of the world's ships afloat had been built in America. Half of all the production goods in the world were coming out of America in 1945. we had a sense of invincibility. We had a sense of righteousness. Those are not wrong necessarily, but we also had a sense, I believe, of military solutions to foreign problems. And I think that is one of the reasons we got mired in Vietnam. We thought there was a military solution when, as we know, there was not. And that has been a pitfall for us. And I hope that as we go forward, we have a much smaller military, despite spending an enormous portion of our national budget on the military, that we recognize the value, first of all, of alliances. It was said during World War II that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them, and we should know that the next time we give a thumb in the eye to our closest friends. I hope we will rebuild those alliances, those friendships, recognize the vitality and the utility of NATO, not to mention the United Nations, because these are all going to be critical as we go through this coming decade. First, to get through the immediate problem of a global pandemic, but also as we see the rise of totalitarian regimes or populist regimes that have a fascist bent. And we're not going to defeat them militarily. That is not how it's going to end up. You don't want to get in a war with China ever. There is no military solution that's going to solve the growing Eastern European fondness for strong men. We've got to do it in other ways, and we can do it in other ways. I think we've been, over the course of our history since World War II, at times quite shrewd about it. We're looking for another George Marshall, aren't we? We're looking for somebody who is a soldier when you need him, but when you really need him, he's a great diplomat, and he is a great alliance builder. And he knows that power does not necessarily come out of the barrel of a gun. It comes out of the power of your ideas and the strength of your economy and the enthusiasm and vigor of your people. So I hope so. If military solutions are going to be our default choice, then it's not a good path. It will not lead us to where we want to be, and I'm quite certain of that. I've been writing about war my entire professional life. One of the things I know absolutely is that it never goes the way you think it's going to go. And when you get involved in a war, whether it's in Iraq in 2003 or in Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, it just never goes as you think it's going to. And you're fooling yourself if you think that you can steer history in that way. So that's a great question. And I'm hoping that, that we collectively, 330 million of us, will be wise enough to see that we need to be wise.
Well, I think that's a great note to end this part of the evening on. Rick, I want to thank you again for a wonderful presentation and a magnificent book. Thank you for taking the time to answer some of our questions tonight. I want to make sure I again thank Rachel Hammer and Colleen Gill of our staff here who did so much work to put together this evening's program. This was a very unusual, talk about things not going the way that you planned. This was not what we had planned this year, and Rachel and Colleen in particular did a marvelous job of putting together tonight's event, and I'm very grateful to them, and to Perlow Productions, who have helped with the video production tonight and done a really remarkable job. This is the part of the evening where I normally get to say, you know, have a safe trip home and safe travels. But fortunately, this is one of the perks of this mode is you don't have to travel anywhere. But I'm super grateful that you've shared this time with us. I look forward to next year, to seeing you again in person, and to having a lot more connection with you over the course of the coming year. So again, thank you and good night. And I hope we get to see each other soon.
I pulled myself off the mute.